So, welcome to week 5 of Introduction to American Politics, Political Science 1101. This week, we're going to be finishing up political behavior by talking about political parties and voting and elections. I think once you get through this week's sessions, you'll see kind of how all of the different political behavioral aspects kind of fit together and help American citizens provide linkages to their government. So just as a quick recap, yet again, of course, we're talking about a game about political power. That political power leads to politics, the means of expressing that political power. Once you have the political dynamics, you can create public policy, which again is government choosing to do something or choosing not to do something. If government chooses to do something or potentially chooses not to do something, that could create bias, and that bias leads back to power. And what we've done so far, kind of at the beginning of this session of the class, was discuss the various games ideas: constitutionalism, federalism, civic engagement. We've also been focused on, over the past several weeks, the idea of political behavior. And this kind of fits into my thinking about the players that link citizens to government and politics. Certainly citizens are players. Certainly the government, the different components, once we get into that aspect, can be thought of as players in the game as well. But we've been talking about public opinion, the media, and interest groups. And so this week, what we're going to do is focus on two more important components of political behavior. The first is political parties. That's in Chapter 9. And then in Chapter 7, voting and elections. And we'll see how the two kind of very much interact with each other, but then also bring in aspects of public opinion, the media, and interest groups as well. And again, remember, these are mechanisms that link the citizen to the government. So you can think of them as players, but more importantly, they help to link or provide linkages to the government by the citizens. So I just want to start off before getting into the questions that you should think about with political parties. Think about how you can view political parties as really three distinct players. When we think of political parties, generally we think of, well, there's the Democratic Party and there's the Republican Party, and there are other minor parties, libertarians, constitutionalists, green parties. Some people say that there's an independent party as well in American politics. But I think in terms of thinking about political parties in general, no matter what the partisan affiliation, you can think of political parties as really three distinct players in the game of politics. And the way that I oftentimes describe political parties is as a triangle. There are three distinct corners or three distinct aspects to a political party if you think of it in a kind of triangular approach. The first way to think about a political party is the political party in government, or what we political scientists generally refer to as the party in government, or PIG, short abbreviation for it. This is where the political parties are represented in government, so specifically in Congress. Democrats who belong to the U.S. House of Representatives, Republicans who are senators, members of the state house who are Republicans or Democrats. Mayors could also be part of a political party in the government. These are folks that work in the governmental institutions, typically the legislature and the executive branch, the presidency. A second way to think about political parties is that the political party is an organization or as an organization. And here, what we're talking about specifically are the Republican National Party, the Democratic National Party, or you could even have the North Carolina Democratic Party or the North Carolina Republican Party. You could even drive it down further to the local level and have the Rowan County Republican Party and the Rowan County Democratic Party. These are political parties that serve as an organization, kind of like the structure of a political party. You go from the national party organization down to the state party organization, down to the local party organization. And then the final way to think of political parties is as in the electorate, the political party in the electorate, or PI, as opposed to political party as an organization. I oftentimes refer to it as PAO. But the political party in the electorate are generally considered to be the voters. Democrats who vote, Republicans who vote. Sometimes we hear independents or unaffiliateds. Actually, they are more partisan in nature, but they like to think of themselves as independents. But if you talk about Republican voters or Democratic voters, what you're doing is you're talking about the party in the electorate. So PIG, PI, PAO, three distinct ways to think of political parties as an organization, as government representatives, as the voters, but they all are players in the game of politics. So hopefully this will help kind of contextualize the idea of a political party. It's very complex. And so there are going to be several questions to consider as you're reading through Chapter 9 in terms of thinking about political parties. First and foremost, think about what characteristics make up a political party. And it might be good to compare this to what you know about interest groups. Interest groups have certain characteristics that differentiate it from a political party. What differs or differentiates a political party from interest groups? How have political parties formed in American politics? There's been a very long history. We've had multiple types of political parties formed and operate in American politics. But in particularly, what are some important characteristics about how the Democratic and the Republican parties have formed? We have two major parties. And in a little bit, you'll see a question related as to why we only have two political parties. That'll get answered in the chapter. But in particularly, think about how the Democratic and the Republican parties came about and how they continuously operate. What is the environment like that political parties operate in, such as the elections rules of the game? Now, here we're talking about kind of pulling back into some of the ideas of American politics. What are the election rules? But also, it helps to define why we have two major parties. It's oftentimes based on the rules of the game. What are the major characteristics of a realigning election? We oftentimes see a critical or important election happen that kind of shifts the dynamics of the country as a whole. 1932, the presidential election of FDR, is generally considered to be a realigning election. Before 1932, the United States was generally a majority Republican Party dominated country. After 1932, the Democrats dominated the political landscape. And then what other kinds of realigning elections has the United States had? How can you define, as I did just previously in terms of the triangle approach, the party in the electorate, the party as an organization, and the party in government? And then finally, how has American politics become polarized due to political parties? And what has caused this political polarization? We all know, if you even just look at American politics, you will see how bitterly divided we are. This polarization has come about because primarily of political parties, but other aspects as well. Think about what those causes are and how has American politics become so polarized. So those are the questions to consider about political parties. Now I just want to give a very brief overview as to how to think about and view campaigns, elections, and voting. The book primarily focuses on elections and voting, but I like to throw in campaigns because they're important components as well. And thinking about campaigns and elections, these two activities in the game of politics really bring together the different groups, the different players together, and culminate in a major political participation, civic engagement activity, voting. Now, you can think of the different players, certainly political parties, the candidates that they nominate, the organizations that help to run the campaigns, voter loyalty and preferences. Here, think about the candidates. If they're elected, they get to serve in government. That's the pig. The organizations, they want to get the voters out, grassroots mobilization efforts, voter registration drives. That's the party as an organization, PAO. The voter loyalty and preferences. Oftentimes, if somebody says, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, they're going to vote that way. That's voter loyalty, the party and the electorate. Along with political parties in campaigns and elections, certainly interest groups, kind of going back to the previous section, interest groups influence and support candidates, and they oftentimes mobilize and help get their members to actually go out and be voters as well. The media has a role. They report, they characterize campaigns and elections. Oftentimes, that idea of horse race coverage, really focus on who's up, who's down, who's winning, who's losing. Maybe not so much the policies and the issues at the heart of an election. And then finally, citizens. Remember, American citizens are the source of governing authority. We select, we pick, we elect the officials who will make decisions for us. That's the idea of a democratic republic. Voting on election day, or potentially before election day, represents the culmination of a major form of political participation. But it's important to note, this is not the only form of the way citizens can participate. It's a major form. Everybody tends to focus on it, but it's not the only one. And so with campaigns and elections and voting, some of the questions to consider, and this is going to be kind of a two-stage or two-screen list, but it's also listed in Blackboard. You can just cut and paste it. What are the different ways that citizens register to vote? In some states, in particularly one state, you don't have to register to vote. You just show up. In other states, you have to do certain things in order to register. What are those different ways to thinking about how citizens register to vote? Are there issues and controversies surrounding who is allowed to register to vote? That has been a major source of controversy. And in fact, we're seeing right now some states passing laws that limit how voters can actually vote. What are some of those issues? What are some of those controversies? Well, there are different ways to think about counting who shows up to vote. We oftentimes talk about the idea of turnout. Well, there are different ways to measure turnout. The book will give you some different ways to think about it. What might be some factors that influence who shows up to vote? And what might be some challenges to getting voters to turn out to vote? And then what are the different stages of an election? An election kind of goes through very distinct stages. You'll want to be thinking about how those different phases of the election leads up to the November general election. Some other questions: what are the differences between primary elections and caucuses? We've got an election next year, 2022. Right now, a lot of candidates are announcing their intent to seek their party's nomination. That's part of the primary elections caucus process. How does the Electoral College influence the race for the presidency? This past year has been monumental in terms of the 2020 election, and the Electoral College had a lot of influence on who was finally decided to be the president and the president-elect. What do candidates need to do in order to be successful, both at the primary and the general election stages? There are some certain characteristics that oftentimes candidates who are successful at winning will have done. What factors help a voter make a decision on who to vote for? This is oftentimes what we in political science call political behavior, voter behavior, and as part of political behavior. And oftentimes a voter may not know who the candidate is, but they have cues, they have other aids that will help them make a decision as to who to vote for. How has technology influenced campaigns and elections? Just as technology has influenced society, it has really reshaped campaigns and elections. And then finally, what is the idea of a direct democracy? We generally tend to think of voting in elections as being, we're going to elect somebody who's going to represent me, a senator, a U.S. representative, a state representative, a mayor, a city council member. They're going to do all the decision making for me, and I decide if I want to keep them or not in a vote. Well, there's also the idea of direct democracy, and that is the citizens actually voting on policy issues. That's the idea of direct democracy. So at the end of this week, what you should be able to do is understand the roles and the activities of political parties in American politics. Also understand how campaigns and elections impact American politics. And then finally, what factors influence Americans to vote, or maybe not to vote, in elections. And again, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to let me know. Happy to set up a collaborate session with you or talk to you via email and answer any questions you have about this material. Good luck with week 5.